This week on Dialogue, our water planet, the Cousteau Legacy. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. This week's guest was selected as National Geographic Emerging Explorer in 2008. During that same year, Alexandra Cousteau established the Blue Legacy organization to continue her family's work. She also co-founded Earth Echo International with her brother and mother, and is a member of the third generation of the Cousteau family to devote their lives to exploring and explaining the natural world. Alexandra, welcome to Dialogue. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, John.
As I mentioned to you before we began taping, I should confess to our viewers and listeners as well, I'm very thrilled to have this opportunity. I grew up on your grandfather's programming, and it certainly was formative for me, and if I wasn't a math idiot, I might be doing some exploring of the oceans myself. And I want to ask you, though, what's your earliest memory of the family business? At what point in your life did you really understand what was happening around you?
Well, I went on my first expedition when I was just 4 months old to
Right,
Easter
but I'm
Islands.
guessing you don't remember that one.
I don't remember that one, but I think it was always just a way of life for us. It was a way of seeing the world. It was a way of being together. It was a way of feeling meaningful in what we were doing and doing it with great camaraderie in the crew. So I think that the experience was always a part of my life.
You're describing something that's almost seamless. You didn't really think of it as a profession. It was just life.
Yes, yes.
Was there a moment where you understood that this was something you could do for a living and pursue professionally?
No. I just sort of kept going. You know, my grandfather taught me to dive the summer I turned 7. And we went out in a small boat in the Mediterranean off the coast of southern France, and he had fashioned a little miniature dive suit for me. It was before we had buoyancy compensating devices and all of that, so I just had a little tank on rubber suspenders and a little mask.
It's handy to have an inventor as a grandparent.
And then the regulator, which, you know, was a full-size regulator, you know, probably covered half my face. I was peering over it as I was looking down into the water, wondering how this was going to help me breathe and having some doubts. But before I had a chance to protest, my grandfather sidled up next to me and gave me his signature wink and a big smile, and off we went.
So was there fear to overcome, though? You mentioned doubts. Would you call it fear, or was this something that came so naturally to you?
Well, I'd been swimming. My parents started teaching me to swim when I was 3 months old, and I was water safe by the time I was a year old, again, before memory. So I always felt very comfortable in the water, but I think I had some concerns, yeah. I knew you can't breathe underwater, and I wasn't quite sure how this thing was going to help me do that. But once we were underwater, I took a couple tentative breaths, and it worked, and I started swimming straight down, and I found myself surrounded by a school of tiny silverfish. And, you know, they were all swimming in unison around me, and the sunlight was glinting off their small silver bodies, and it was just such an incredible thing.
Yeah. How do you ever walk away from that?
No, I think I was hooked.
Yeah.
I was really hooked. I, for the first time, understood the fascination and passion and dedication that my father, Philippe, and my grandfather had for this extraordinary place.
And was there any ever sense of pressure of continuing the family business, or was this a natural progression, just like taking to the waters for you?
I think it was just what we do.
I guess here's what I'm thinking of, Alexandra. I could think of a friend of mine who, she was the daughter of a doctor, a very prominent doctor, and for some reason she was trying to avoid the family business. But eventually, after trying other things, she's now a doctor, practicing in the same city that her father practiced in. And I'm wondering, for you, was there ever any moment where you thought you wanted to do something different, or was this just so a part of who you were that there never really was that moment of making a choice?
Yeah, there never was that moment. I think, my cousins, I think they tried other things before they came back into the family fold. But for my brother Philippe and I, it's just always been our path.
And when you travel and do your work currently, what is the Cousteau legacy as far as the people you encounter? How much do they remember your father and your grandfather's work?
Everywhere, all around the world, and it's so funny because I have just so many stories from people now. I remember I was coming back into the United States, and there was an elderly woman who was the customs officer, and she looked at my passport and asked me if I was any relation. And when I said yes, she got a little bit teary, and she said, she said to me, my husband was a postal worker his entire life, and just a couple years ago he finally retired, and his lifelong dream had been to be able to scuba dive like Jacques Cousteau, and so he finally got to go scuba diving like Jacques Cousteau, and he is a happier man because he finally got to go where your grandfather had gone for so long. Repairmen, workmen who come to my home and see photographs ask me, and they have their stories. A cabbie in Costa Rica almost drove off the road when he found out because he got so excited. It's a nice way of honoring his legacy.
I completely relate to that. As I expressed to you earlier, or confessed to you, that I grew up on the programming as well and watched with my grandfather, who was a coal miner who left school in the 5th grade to work the mines. But for him, he had an active mind and explored the world through programs like this. And I get it. I know how their reaction, I understand it. Tell us about Blue Legacy and about your current work.
Well, I had been living for several years in Central America, working on all sorts of different aspects of marine conservation, from working with heads of state on policy about marine mammal protection or anti-shark finning, all the way down to the very local level, working with fishing communities on alternative sustainable livelihoods. And I realized in all the work that I was doing with the oceans that so much of the impacts that we were working against came from land, came from the choices people make, whether it's the seafood choices they make, what they put down their toilet, what they send down their streets into our rivers. And I realized that we really need to shape the conversation around how interconnected our water really is. The only separating factor really between our freshwater and our oceans in terms of how we make policy and how we manage our industry and how we think about it is salinity. That's the only measure. And yet those are connected systems. And so because of that fragmentation, people don't realize that freshwater needs to reach the sea. Some of the most productive parts of the oceans are where freshwater reaches the coast. So Blue Legacy's mission is to tell those stories and to help shape our dialogue in the 21st century about how interconnected our systems are and how incredibly important it is for us to look at our own communities and how we depend on our water resources and how we're shaping those resources, most of the time for the worse, and get involved at the local level in protecting them.
And I'm guessing that when you encounter people in your travels, that the farther they are from the coast, literally, the more this awareness just begins to drop off. If they're part of a seafaring community, they have a better sense of their relation to the water. But if they're in farmlands or areas that appear landlocked, not so much.
It's harder, but that's why what I try to help people understand through our films and through our community activation programs is that your waterfront is your backyard. Your waterfront can be the storm drain on your street. It can be the river or the stream that runs near your house. But all of those things end up in the ocean. But the places that matter to us are our backyards, our communities, and the water that shapes the land that we live on. It shapes our experience of the environment. It shapes how healthy and vibrant our community is. And we need to understand that this global water crisis that we keep talking about as something that's happening in another place is actually happening in our communities here in North America. And we need to take our water back. We need to look inwards to our communities, to our backyards, and find out where our water comes from, what happens to us, it passes through our lives, where it goes when it leaves us, and what the threats are. Because we often hear people say, well, if you want to help water, turn the tap off. And that's, we shouldn't waste water because it's a precious resource. So it's a good thing to do, but it's not necessarily going to change the situation in our community. And I think if we want to know how to help water, we need to find out where it comes from.
I want to take a look at a clip from a piece of your recent work that focuses on our local prominent waterway, the Potomac River.
Yes.
So let's take a look and then we'll come back and,
All right.
and talk about it.
We are disconnected, we are fragmented, and we have lost touch. As I travel the world, I have discovered these common themes in the way we all look at water. Even in our own backyards, we no longer recognize what a healthy water system needs to survive.
A watershed is really, kind of the gathering place for the river. All the land, all the forests, all the wetlands that exist across the landscape, sort of feed into the river. And so, how we manage the land directly impacts the quality and the health of the river. We all live in a watershed. The earth is composed of watersheds, and the river is the gathering place for all of what happens on the land. I think it was Luna Leopold said, in some sense, the health of our waters are the clearest measure of how we live on the land.
Here in North America, how do we impact watersheds primarily, and what consequences does that have for human settlements?
We're a population of 300 million people now, and so we've expanded out into the watersheds to live in rural towns and big cities, and so we've drained wetlands to put in shopping malls, and we've cleared forests. And so all of that work of nature that we rely on for clean water is going away. And as a consequence, the quality and reliability of the water supply begins to diminish.
The Potomac River watershed is steeped in American history and heritage. Its rivers and tributaries flow through 14,600 square miles of unique landscape. From high in the forests of the Appalachian Mountains, its purified waters wind down over great falls, through spectacular rapids, past our nation's capital, and out into the Chesapeake Bay. The most free-flowing of the eastern United States' large rivers, the Potomac truly is our nation's river. Yet despite its wild beauty, this river was not so long ago declared a national disgrace. And today, the Potomac barely sits on the edge of recovery. I took a journey through its mighty rapids and found that sometimes it takes an apparently pristine river to show us that water systems in crisis are all around us.
I want to ask you about this notion of disconnectedness that your narration in the beginning of the film brings up. Why do you think that's happening? I mean, one of the things that I've been alarmed by is when you look at polls. I've been involved in civic education a big part of my life and working with youth groups. And about a decade ago, when you'd poll youth on issues of most concern, things like climate change or global warming were at the top of the list. Environmental issues in general, they've dropped. And I wonder if it's just an acute reaction to the economic downturn, but what is your sense of this disconnection? What is its source?
Well, I think a big part of it has to do with the miracles of modern engineering. We have solved the water distribution issue. We've solved the safe drinking water and sanitation issue in this country. And we have almost 1 million miles of infrastructure crisscrossing the nation.
So are you describing complacency?
No, I think we just take it for granted. We turn on the tap and the water is there and it's safe to drink. And it's hard to imagine that our systems are breaking down. But consider for a moment that the Colorado River no longer reaches the sea. A delta the size of Rhode Island has dried up and become a desert. The Sea of Cortez that once had a thriving estuary because of that flush of fresh water from the Colorado River now has crashed. The fishing is largely disappeared. Then we have the Mississippi River, which drains 40% of this country. From Montana to Pennsylvania, all the way down to Louisiana, that is one big watershed, and it ends in a dead zone. In the southeast of the United States, 60% or more of our lakes, rivers, streams are unfit for swimming, drinking, and fishing. I mean, we have some serious issues in this country that we need to address, and yet we're largely unaware of them because water seems so abundant. And that myth of abundance is finally reaching an age of limits. And so in some parts of the country, right now in Texas, certainly they're aware that we are living in an age of limits. They have a terrible drought. People are suffering horribly because of it. But we fail to recognize, I think, many times that that is impacting the health of our community, the prosperity of our community. You know, we thrive in a clean, healthy environment. We thrive when our air is fit to breathe, our water is fit to drink, when there's an abundance of nature around us to go, so we can go hunting and fishing and recreate, and it creates healthier communities. We've forgotten that, and I think we feel like we have to make a choice between the economy and the environment, and that's a false dilemma. A healthier environment is a more prosperous economy. And when we fail to realize that we don't have to sacrifice one to have the other, then I think we end up sacrificing a lot of the quality of life and the opportunity that we do take for granted.
So much of that political debate is an either-or choice. When someone I know likes to talk in terms of and both versus either or.
Yeah.
But this whole connection thing, I wonder, the people you talked to, the woman you interviewed, obviously she can talk eloquently about this connection and make a case for it. But when you talk to the average person in your travels, I wonder if there's something happening to us in modern life where we're just not just less connected to water, but less connected to the natural world. A couple weeks ago on this program, we focused on the age of connection, talking about social media and internet technologies. And one study was quoted by a guest showing that people who use Facebook more feel less connected to their friends than people who use it less, that there's something counterintuitive going on. And I wonder, is modern life disconnecting us from the physical world?
I think a lot of
Probably
it
someone
is,
like you doesn't relate to that because your life is very connected to the physical world.
But I'm always in somebody's backyard.
Yeah.
You know, I'm always in someone else's community, and it gives me an opportunity to see what they take for granted through a more objective lens. So sometimes I see danger where they think everything's fine. But at other times I see incredible beauty where they take things for granted and don't think they have anything special. So I think part of it is perspective. Part of it is, you know, having had the opportunity to grow up outdoors and, you know, swing on a rope swing in the summertime with friends, or have a favorite watering hole where you can catch frogs and tadpoles and crayfish, or things of that nature. A forest that you spend time in, where you know every log and rock. And but when we either because it's zoning laws have changed, or those places have become mini malls or Walmarts, or because they were polluted in some way, became a Superfund site. I don't know. There's so many reasons that we lose those places.
Your connection to your lineage and your dad and your grandfather, and that the superficial connection, wetsuits and aqualungs, okay, we understand that. But the storytelling part, you're also connected in that way. They were storytellers, you're a storyteller. But talk to us about how you developed your storytelling style. I know it's always a work in progress, but how do you think about it? Right? It is. And how do you approach it? What are your inspirations? What are you trying to communicate?
Well, when I think back to when my grandfather got started, he had to invent many of the tools that he took into the field with him. It wasn't just the regulator and scuba diving. It was the underwater camera, the underwater flash, the underwater sound, underwater everything, because it didn't really exist. And, you know, he and my grandmother would go get 35 millimeter film and get under the covers of their bed so they could splice together that film into 3-minute long reels. And then they would put that in the camera, put the camera in a bell jar, take the bell jar down, and they would just be able to do these short segments, and they would build their films in that way. Today we have incredible high definition cameras. We can practically edit the film on the camera,
right.
You know, and we can distribute rough cuts. We can distribute 2-minute films, 20-minute films, an hour films immediately online to a whole network of people who care about the issue, who share it with their friends, who talk about it, who become experts in their own right and get engaged. So I think it's a very different time, and more than anything else, I think our storytelling style is really working towards engaging people online through short films, because I don't want to ask someone to tune in every Sunday night at 8 o'clock, because I know in my life that's not possible. Even if I really want to see a show or program or film, there's no way that I can guarantee that with my schedule I'll be able to watch it at the time that it's showing. But what if I love that film and I want to share it with my friends? Where do I send them? How do I engage them in conversation about it? How do I share my thoughts with them about something that they haven't seen, that because they didn't have a chance to tune in or didn't know about it? So we have traditionally done 2 long expeditions, one in 2009, one in 2010. 2009 was 100 days around the world. I had 7 people with me, and it was so exciting. We went to India and Cambodia and Africa and the Middle East, looking at different water issues in different communities and understanding how it impacts us in a whole host of different ways. But we invited people to join us on that expedition, and that's why we went for so long, was because we wanted people to tune in and see our latest film that we would post, or daily blogs, photo galleries, thoughts, we would post interviews with experts that we met with in the field, all in an effort to get people to feel that they were there with us as much as we possibly could, and that they could share that content with friends. They could post it on their blog or on their Facebook page. And it was very successful. It was an experiment, but it worked. And when we came back to the United States, we got a lot of feedback. And one of the things that people said was, gosh, that was an incredible adventure. Thanks for taking us along for the ride. But clearly there is a global water crisis. Now I understand that. I'm just so relieved it's not happening in America. And I thought, oh my Lord, all right, I guess we have an expedition to do in America.
Yeah, they got half the message. Right?
Exactly. So in 2010, that's what we did, and that's why we did it. We did an expedition across 18,000 miles of North America, Canada, US, and Mexico. And that trip really taught me more than any other about what this global water crisis means and how it's impacting our communities, and how we need to work together to take our water back.
Help me understand some of the details about what you're calling a global water crisis in the broad sense. Individual issues or circumstances, how does it manifest itself? A lack of fresh water in some communities. What would be the list of things that add up to this global crisis?
Well, I think traditionally our understanding of the global water crisis has been very narrow. We have talked about it mostly in terms of the very real water and sanitation crisis that's happening in the developing world. Mm-hmm. And those are part of the UN Millennium Development Goals. There's an enormous amount of American and international philanthropy and knowledge and technology that's going to solving this. And largely, it's a solvable problem. It's not only environmental, it's also an issue of governance and corruption and infrastructure and other things. But these are things that we can solve. We've identified it, and if we work together, we can solve it.
Using the local watershed as a case study in this, the Potomac River and its connection to the Chesapeake Bay and its connection to the Atlantic Ocean, how are we doing? If you were Dr. Cousteau giving a health checkup to that watershed, what would you recommend?
Well, the Potomac River was recently named one of the most endangered river in the United States. Yeah, and I think it's because it's impacted by so many different things. It's impacted by agriculture. It's impacted by municipalities. There's more and more people living in this watershed, and so there's more and more runoff. Runoff from our streets, runoff from our homes. There's sewer overflow issues when it rains, so raw sewage is going into the river. There's a lot of chemical contamination. You know, we have 80,000 chemicals that we have allowed to permeate our environment without really understanding the impacts of those. So many of those we found out are endocrine disruptors. We see that in male bass that have ovaries in their testes, which is a condition called intersex. Mm-hmm. And so clearly there's an issue in the water.
I guess one of the things I'm trying to figure out, I remember when your grandfather brought the Calypso to the Potomac and was
Yes.
part of the research on the dead zones that were forming, and Hydrilla, I think, was the plant at the time. Have we just slowed the rate of, I know there's been some improvement in that regard, but have we just slowed the rate of deterioration, or are we actually improving the situation?
Well, in Nixon's time, when he signed the Clean Water Act, it was because rivers like the Potomac were in such bad shape, and they could see it, from their office window. The Clean Water Act, which is under fire and being undermined in so many ways, it's just terrifying to me, changed the quality of our water all across the nation. It protected our water. Why anyone would want to undermine that is something I do not understand. But the threats to our water are different today, which is why we need an even stronger act. Before, it was industrial effluent and what we were putting in the water that we could see. The Hudson River would change color daily based on the paper mills and what color paper they were printing that day. It was something that we could see. But today it's
the chemicals
endocrine
you describe,
disruptors.
it's invisible.
You don't see it. The water can be perfectly transparent.
Because I don't want to rush you on this because it's important, but we, believe it or not, only have about a minute left, and I can't, in good conscience, not ask you, what can people do who want to make a difference in the remaining time that we have?
That is a wonderful question. And by all means, turn off your tap when you brush your teeth. But also find out where your water comes from. What watershed do you live in? Where does your water come from? What are the threats to that resource? And who are the groups that are fighting so hard to protect it? Here in Washington, D.C., the Potomac River Keepers are sort of our water warriors. But there are water keepers, river keepers, creek keepers. There's other water organizations working at the grassroots level in communities across America. And if you want to know how to protect your water, pick up the phone, call them, and ask them, and they will tell you.
And I'll put in a plug for Blue Legacy, too, is under alexandracousteau.org. That's right. Thank you for joining us. It's really been a pleasure. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.